He's Howard Ibach, former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back, Henry. Today we have a guest, Ed Cotton. He has a longtime strategist, worked for some major agencies on some major brands. He started a blog post about 6 months ago called Provoke, and he wrote an amazing post about creative briefs and briefing. We're going to talk to him about that and his experience. Let's join the conversation. Okay. Henry, we're back. We are delighted to have on this episode of the Brief Brothers our new friend, Ed Cotton. Ed is a strategist who has worked for some of the better shops in our business, McCann-Erickson on a number of occasions, and then I don't want to mispronounce it, Butler, Shine, and Stern and Partners for 20 years. Yeah. And now you are a strategy consultant who is a podcaster himself and also the author fairly recently of a blog called Provoke, which is what came to my attention through our friend Lance Saunders, and provoked, to coin a phrase, me to dive in and kind of get lost in a happy way on all of your great thoughts on the creative brief and to reach out to you to join us. So we're going to looking forward to a great conversation. So Ed Cotton, Henry and I welcome you to the Brief Brothers.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. I'm amazed that somehow the newsletter made its way to you through this very clogged media landscape we have, where it's almost impossible to find anything. But I have some more faith now since you found it.
Well, that's great, because I couldn't recommend your thinking more, and especially this particular post, because it is chock full of great information from a variety of well-known thinkers in our industry on the creative brief, and we're going to talk about that. But before we dive in and talk about briefs, which is what Henry and I love to talk about, we could go on and on and on, we like to ask our guests to share with our viewers a little bit of their background. And I like to start by asking, how the heck did you find your way to advertising, Ed? And then maybe give us a little trajectory of your career.
Yeah, well, I don't exactly know, other than I did when I did study business at college, and the only thing I really enjoyed was marketing. I think that was mainly because the professor was actually a practicing consultant. He actually came back and said, "Oh yeah, the other day I was talking to this industrial tools company, and they got this real issue and this real problem with marketing this new." So it was like I felt really relevant, and it felt like, oh yeah, this guy is like, this real stuff to do. And you go into the law class, and it's like a dusty old book on tort or something, and the guy hasn't been in the law profession for 20 years and has no idea what's going on. So I gravitated towards marketing. I ended up meeting a few people. My father worked in public relations for a while, so I kind of had that. He kind of had that background, and so I met a few people. Eventually found my way into what was then called the information department of McCann-Erickson in London, and through a very circuitous route found my way into the what was called the account planning department. So that's where I started. Had a few detours, and then went over to McCann in Seattle, where I was the head of strategies, CSO at that agency, and then went down the West Coast to San Francisco, to Sausalito specifically, to work for a pretty small agency at the time called BSSP, where I stayed for a very, very, very long time. And now I think for the last 6 years, more or less 6 years, I've been doing my own thing.
What motivated you to strike out on your own?
Really, I just didn't really want to. I don't know, a few things, but I think there's a lot of intensity with advertising right now in an ad agency. You are really, if you're a senior leader in an ad agency, 6 years ago or 2024, it is a considerable demand on your life. And I mean, it's 24/7, 365. And I don't really want to do that anymore. I did enough of that. I had 20 years of doing that. So want to get a bit more freedom to do things that outside of the advertising world that I really enjoy, like photography in particular. Also running, and sometimes I do both. Yeah, just pick the projects I want to work on, have more variety, work upstream, work downstream versus just working in the advertising world. So that's really why I am where I'm at. Probably should have done it sooner, earlier.
I think we could probably all share that sentiment about doing other things and doing it sooner. And we can see some examples, I'm guessing, of your photography behind you.
Yeah. This is a brand new project I'm working on, which is to do with a local community that's about 1.5 miles from where I live.
Well, as I said, what drew me to you and how I came to know who you were was because my friend Lance Saunders, who I met at Campbell Methuen in Minneapolis in 2007 or 2008, so some years ago, he was director of strategy, and he was the one person who directed me to some of the better planners, John Steele in particular. He said, you need to read his book if you want to find out more about briefs. Because I was a creative, at the time I was a creative who was trying to figure out, how do I teach this thing called a creative brief when I didn't know what a good one was. So Lance was one of my first teachers. Lance went on to become chief operating officer at DDB in Canada. So he sent me this link to your blog post, which you said is about 6 months old. And this particular post is all about creative briefs. And you have highlighted or provided links to some major thinkers. So John Haggerty, DA&D's, I guess it's their own blog post.
Yeah.
Ed Chu, is that his name? I think, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it.
Yeah.
And I've actually reached out to him, and he's going to come on our show too, because I loved his article about "Is the Brief Dead?" The death of the brief.
Yeah.
So he wrote that about a year ago. So I want to see if he still thinks that way.
Yeah.
And there are some amazing thoughts about the creative brief, which tells me a couple things about you. One, you, after I don't know how many, 20, 30 years in the business, you're still curious about this document that we all use. It's like an old sock in our drawer that we pull out with every project and we make it work. And you're finding new ways to think about it. So that tells me that you still have faith in this document and the process. And yet I saw so many different perspectives from the links that you provided. What is given that this is only a 6-month-old project, the blog called Provoke, what was your motive for doing all this deep diving on the creative brief? Is it safe to assume that you still have faith in it as a way to help us get a project started?
Yeah, I'll just back up a bit and talk about Provoke, and then I'll go into the creative brief piece. Provoke is a newsletter that I produce on Substack. So it's a Substack newsletter. It comes out, periodically. There's no definitive monthly frequency with it. And it's really just a way for me to sort of explore. I think one thing with LinkedIn is you lose the sort of disposability to the content. So it's fleeting. You read a post and then you can't find it again. So there's no sort of collection of LinkedIn posts anywhere. That was my original intent. I was going to do a collection of LinkedIn posts. And then I thought, actually, there's a better idea here. I'll just pick an issue and just focus the newsletter on a specific issue. So I've just put one out today on AI. I've done them. Some of them are really obscure. Like I've just also done one on the Arctic. They're just things that I'm curious about. And hopefully other people are curious too. So the creative, creative and creative brief, the creative brief, was something that is part of a sort of series. There are some other related things, like there's something on changing demographics, there's something on culture, there's one on attention. So there's a series, sort of a collection of issues that relate very specifically to sort of strategy advertising, and then there are some more obscure ones. So the creative brief one was really, I just think for myself to sort of get my head around, like, where it's sort of come from and where it is sort of today. As you suggested, I mean, I do feel it is pretty important. It's important to understand what you're doing before you start to do it. It seems that, and it's a common story, and I'm sure you've heard it a gazillion times, that anyone who knows anything about creative briefs or has read a book about creative briefs always goes to the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel story, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, so it's just it makes the most sense. It's like, the Pope would not commission one of the most marvelous pieces of art in the world. It was almost a corporate commission without some kind of instruction set. So this idea that we're in a business that is a commercial business, where we're moving products, where ideas are simply formed by people who have them in the shower early one morning with no instructions, seems idiotic and off the mark to me. So yeah, I mean, it was the first thing I did when I got my first job as a junior planner. I was told to go write a brief. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I had a piece of paper with a set of questions on it, and I tried my best to answer those questions in the smartest way possible. And kind of, you learn by doing. And I will say that I had one very, very important experience with the creative brief that sort of changed how I thought about it, which I can talk about if you want.
Yes, we're all ears.
Yeah, so back in my day, there was a lot more training. And so, as a young junior strategist, I would be sent on courses, and I would, learn how to do presentations. And it wasn't just someone on a Zoom call telling you in 15 minutes how you're supposed to present. It was like 3 days intense offsite training. And there was training on a creative brief that was called the Creative Brief Role Reversal course. It was run by the IPA in London, and it was quite, I mean, I think anyone who's ever been on it will say it was probably one of the best pieces of training they've ever experienced. 6 or 7 planners from different agencies, and we are told to become creatives. We have marker pens, and we have flip charts, and we get these things called briefs given to us by creatives. They might present them to us, they might read them to us, but then we get a bit of paper. And throughout the course of the day, we do creative work as strategists based on these briefs. So it's basically, the idea is, walking in other people's shoes, i.e. the people that you're ultimately going to be writing the briefs. So over the course of the day, the briefs get sharper, they get better, they get more focused, and the work gets better and more focused as a result. So it's a really simple idea. I have never heard of it being done in the United States. I really think it really teaches you a lot as a young planner, young strategist, really what you're being asked to do and why this document matters to the people who you give it to.
That's brilliant. And I haven't heard it either. I think Henry and I have kind of done versions of this. When I do my training, it's mostly with marketers. Occasionally I'll have a strategist, a few creatives will show up, because the corporate companies that I do business with often have in-house agencies, so they get the creatives in on my training. And what I do
Yeah.
is I call it a reverse engineering exercise. We'll look at some
Yeah.
creative and try to
Yeah.
figure out the brief. It's
Yeah.
not quite the same as what you've said. So I love this idea.
And I would
of-
say, I would add that the creatives who were teaching us were some of the best in the business.
I imagine
So it wasn't
so.
just creatives for creative's sake. These
Yeah.
were serious creative directors who appreciated the benefits of having a good brief. Didn't
Because we see them
predisposed. Yeah.
because we see great briefs so infrequently. That's the sad truth. We had more Ed Cottons and Henry Gomez's in the world, that would be a different story. But I hear this all the time. When I took a series of creatives through my workshop, one of the things that one of them said was, I've always known when I get a bad brief, but I didn't have the vocabulary to push back and say why. So that's one of the things that I think is so incumbent upon creatives, is to say, I need to have the information to be able to criticize the brief. Henry likes to call it stress test it. He stress tests his briefs, but creatives often don't know how to do that. I mean, they just say, oh, yeah, that's not a good brief, but I can't articulate exactly why. I just know that after I've gone through the briefing, I still have questions that, it's like one of the creatives that I took my training, he said, I go through a briefing, I listen for 30 minutes, and then I say, so what is it you want us to do?
Yeah.
Because he doesn't have the vocabulary to ask the right questions, to push back.
But I think you bring up a good point with training, with kind of the role reversal, and Howard alluded to it. It's not the same, and it's not going to be as valuable, but I do, every time I write a brief, I am consciously aware of the audience and trying to reassure myself that the brief that I've written is something from which ideas can come from. And so I usually take the extra step to come up with some thought starters, not just because I want to see the creatives explore those thought starters, because they generally don't anyway, but to show that, kind of as a proof of concept, that the strategy, the brief, does have like an internal coherence to it, and that it can inspire some degree of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to do a screen share, and I want to show off your blog so the rest of the world can see it. And then there's so much to talk about here. I wanted to ask you a question related specifically to some of the links. So here's the this is the Substack location, and you, I think, chose a great cartoon from Tom Fishburne, the types of creative brief that we're accustomed to seeing. But what you've done here is you've identified it's the past, present, and future of the brief, and you've grabbed little excerpts from some great thinkers. I've read this essay by Dave Trott in one of his books. I have a couple of his books. This one from D&D on how to break down a creative brief is brilliant. Sir John Haggerty, on a recent LinkedIn post, comments on the new creative brief. I actually did a TikTok video on this. I thought that was brilliant, how social comments are now the new creative brief. Bonnie Wan, I'm not sure how you pronounce her name. Juan, creative brief to the life brief. I mean, I've always thought of the creative brief as something useful far beyond our industry. A great quote here from Jay Shelburne, words matter. Like I said, Ed Sue is going to be on an upcoming episode. We're talking about his article, The Death of the Brief. We simply just don't have time anymore. There's just some great stuff. Of all these links and to much longer articles, do you have a favorite?
I actually really like Michael Lee's presentation. It's further up. Good proposition.
This one here, this card, this little, yeah, I like that too.
Well, it's if you're a member of the APG UK, which not everyone is, you can listen to Michael's presentation. Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I mean, the sharp end of it's sort of like the sharp end of the brief is the proposition. So everything sort of that's the focal point, and everything sort of is built around it. So to me, it's a pretty good. I mean, he takes a very pretty traditional view, but a very, I think, measured and thoughtful view of getting the proposition right. I do think there is sort of like a bit of I think the UK benefits from having had account planners for maybe 25 years longer than the US. So I do think the embedding of strategy, I mean, I can't believe that some of the best ad schools, I mean, I still think to this day, the creative professors are like, oh, creatives, you don't need to talk to your strategist. They're a waste of time. So if you're told that as a creative student at a school, I don't know what that means when you go into the workplace. It means, you don't go in with a positive perspective. You've been indoctrinated into believing that there is no value. So, whereas I do think in the UK there are agencies with, BBH being one, with a strategist founder, with an account planner founder, whereas in the US is mainly creatives. If they're breakaway agencies or agencies that are formed, they're usually creative teams that are the center of it. So I do think one of the challenges in the US is, why are you telling me what to do?
That's an interesting observation. I have on my desktop a PDF that was just sent to me by a guy named Alex Morris. It's called Creatives on Strategists. It's almost 200-page PDF. And it essentially is discussing the tension, what he thinks is the natural tension between strategy and creative. Tension not in the sense of resentment, but in, struggling to get to a good proposition or to a good brief. I haven't read it yet. It's a long discussion, but someone sent it to me, and I want to dive deeper into that. As a former creative, I'm familiar with the tension of getting a good brief, but it's a foreign concept to me to see strategists as anything other than a partner. So maybe I'm just not as in
Well,
touch.
look, I mean, I can appreciate both. I can appreciate both sides of the story. If the creative process is one that is extremely mentally intensive, and where distractions are real disruptions, and where sitting in a meeting for 30 minutes, unless it's really valuable and useful, is a complete it's time away from concepting. I do tend to find that creatives have too much on their plate. It's not like they have the luxury of, guys, we're giving you 3 weeks to work on this one brief for a quarter-page ad in a baseball program. Never happens. You got like 11 things you're working on. And there's account directors who want to dragging you into a meeting that you really don't need to be in. And now there's a creative brief that you don't understand. So I have total sympathy for anyone who feels like a lot of the time has been spent, that they've spent, or there have been many occasions where their time has felt like it's been wasted. So yeah, totally empathize with that feeling. What I will say is, and I think it's part of Ed's point in the death of the creative brief, is we are living in very changed times from the early days of the late 60s and 70s, where people had time and they did the research, and the brief actually brought something to life that was enlightening. People didn't have Google. Look, I mean, how many creatives now are on AI? Like, it could be you could ask ChatGPT to try and be the best strategist in the world and tell you to create a brief. 24
Well, we all
hours.
know we all know that's not going to happen. They're not good at original thinking, but they're good at supportive, for
Yeah, I mean,
research.
I'm not saying it's there yet, but all I'm saying is creatives aren't sitting on their behinds waiting for a strategist to issue the next and latest and greatest proclamation. And even before the days of the internet, some of the creative people I knew would take matters into their own hands. They would, one team in particular working on a car account went out drinking in a pub and decided to call the head of a car club at 11:30 at night and say, we want to talk about Volvo. Can we do it? Bought 2 bottles of whiskey, went to this guy's house, took 25 pages of notes, and came back with a better understanding of Volvo than the planner had given them. So, I think we sometimes, the younger planners, they don't get what's going on in the creative's mind. They're intimidated by the whole process. They're afraid to say anything in a meeting for fear of being judged. And it's a really hard place to be, to find yourself constrained with the resources and time and a blank piece of paper that you're supposed to fill out that's supposed to be the next most amazing piece of writing since Ernest Hemingway wrote Old Man in the Sea. I don't know.
Well, no
So,
pressure, no pressure, Ed.
yeah.
But
So I
I
think
mean,
so. I think what's happening is this, as a result of all this is changing. As we see, people could spend time and could come up with briefs that were really based on very highly original thoughts versus speculations. And, it's original thoughts that came out of, look at the Got Milk brief. I mean, there was a lot of work that went into that. It wasn't just John Steele waking up one morning and saying, hey, there's this thing called, there were a bunch of things. There was a client who gave them a big quantitative deck that said milk goes well with other things. There was a project they did where they took milk away from people. And all of this sort of compounded together to come up with something that ultimately became the brief. Kids these days, anyone these days just doesn't have the time to do that.
well, I think, but let me interrupt you. Forgive me for interrupting you, Ed. I think your post from Charlie Cottrell on We Are Social and his observation that if you are intrepid enough to go onto the comments of social media, I think he exaggerates a little bit by saying that's where your brief is. It's where the big brief can begin. And Pringles campaign, Stuck in Pringles, I think is brilliant. I mean, it's nothing new. Comments have been out there forever, even long before social media. You could go on to Amazon and other online retailers and read comments about products, good, bad, and indifferent. And if you are really smart, you can draw some conclusions about your products. But are the strategists out there intrepid enough to do that? Some of them are. And they're always, Henry and I love to talk about the whole bell curve. There's always going to be brilliant creatives. There'll be brilliant strategists. Most of us will be average. And the ones who are average are going to be the timid ones sitting in the conference room afraid to speak up.
I think that some of the techniques that a strategist would use nowadays are different than 20 years ago, right? And so, like you said, yeah, there's Google and there's Chat GPT, but there's also, I think, life experience that you combine with the right query, right? Like I had to learn very early on when Google first became a thing. I had to become an expert on how to query it, because it wasn't necessarily the most user-friendly thing. The algorithms have gotten smarter in the sense that we can get what we want without being as sophisticated as we used to have to be to get what we wanted. But I think there's always going to be room for old-fashioned, shoe leather. Go to the store and talk to people buying the product and see where it's positioned on the shelf and how the competition is positioned and what are people saying about it. I think the old-fashioned stuff still, honestly, quite surprisingly works really well. So but you touched on it early on, and that is kind of the dearth of training that exists nowadays. And I'm starting to see a comeback, at least within, I can give my employer WPP props that we have a pretty good like learning platform. It's not I don't think we're ever going back to like 3-day travel to a seminar kind of thing, but there is a lot of expertise within the network, and they're making it available to people, which I really like. But I think there was a period of time where the all training kind of just went by the wayside, and that has been a detriment to the agencies and ultimately to the work.
Mhm. Yep.
One of the links that you included, I thought was a fascinating throwback. I think it was it from DA&D,
Mhm.
which was break down the brief.
Mm.
And that was about cutting it from a full brief down to 16 words, down to 8 words, down to 4 words, down to 2 words, if I'm not
Mm.
mistaken.
Yeah,
That's old school. And that's old
yeah,
school.
yeah. Well, that's I've forgotten her name. I've forgotten her name, but she's sort of she does what you do, but in the UK, and been doing it for DNAD for a long time, and she's mainly teaching creatives how to look at briefs, and that's a comment. And she actually commented on, I think, the original post I put on LinkedIn about this newsletter, and I think made a really good point, which was the creative brief is just the start. I think the way I sort of elevated it and talked about it as being the sort of tablet of stone and this iconic piece of writing, maybe elevated it a little too far ahead of itself. Because I do think this is part of the change that we are seeing, where it's about dialogue, and I do think that we're starting to see something along the lines of, we don't have, like, it's much more of a collaboration between the strategists and the creatives than it is a baton passing process. So we now have, let's have a kickoff meeting. The strategist's responsibility may not be to bring in a brief, but to bring in sort of 4 or so directions, that we can talk about. That we may find one of these directions to be the place where we actually build the brief from, but we start with a lot of conversations and discussion, and we agree together where we're going to head, which I think is very, very different from the sort of, okay, the smart people in the strategy department crunch all the numbers, do all the stuff, and they come up with a direction that they believe is the right way to go, and then we course correct following that. Now, because of the resource limitations, we want to change the process and cut out the frictions from past. So we work together earlier, we work together faster, and we coalesce. What I think you find happened a lot in agencies was strategists used to go and put the brief together, and there was no accountability in the creative department. Often these briefs weren't signed off from the creative director, and if they were, he never probably, or she never really read them. And because there was no accountability from the top, the briefs ended up getting sort of like tossed, and they either worked or they didn't work, but there was no one could point to the creatives and say, look, you signed this thing and you were behind it. And so I think a lot of things went by the wayside, a lot of things got wasted, and work that was so off brief ended up getting presented. And I actually think this new way that's been forced upon everyone is a little bit better in some ways than the past, because shared accountability seems really important from my perspective, because if people don't buy into something, and that lack of buy-in is not verbalized, that becomes extremely expensive. It's expensive for the agency, expensive for the client, because no one knows that people have been given something that they don't really want to work on.
Oh, I agree 100%. Do you think this resistance was an agency culture that needed to be overcome? Was it widespread in the industry? What's your take on that, Ed?
Well, I mean, I think it varies from agency to agency, and it varied from case to case and from, different relationships. Some strategists have better relationships with their creatives than others, and some didn't. So I just think there was a sort of, it was hard to sort of, say that there were certain places where it wasn't happening necessarily, but it was more on a case-based basis. But I feel that, if you're going to sign your name on a brief and say you approve it, and you don't believe in it, then that's a problem. That, for me, that should be, I'm not signing this thing because I don't believe in it, and I don't think it's worth the piece of paper it's written on. I'd rather hear that than this thing gets lost in the creative department for weeks and isn't really touched, and then, the day of the internal presentation, we see a bunch of work that's been thrown together at haste, has nothing to do with the original brief. So I think it's just to me, it's a communication issue, and it's a responsibility issue, and it's an accountability issue. And I think, well, all I'm saying really is I think the earlier we can sit in a room together and have a conversation, the better. Because also in those days, what would happen with more time was the strategists got more paternalistic about their ideas and more precious about their ideas. So, I've been working on this thing for 3 weeks. I've done this on the news research. You better do it. Versus if you have you made very little investment, and in terms of like, we're going to meet in 24 hours, do your reading, do your background. Well, let's have some kind of discussion. You got no equity in your ideas. You don't feel like you own them, and you're freer than you would have been if you'd, spent 3 weeks putting something together. So in some ways, we're talking, like, I'm talking at cross purposes. Sometimes I'm saying, the old days were a lot better, but you can actually make the counter argument to say, yeah, we lack quite a few things, but some things might have changed for the better.
What has been the response to this post on Creative Briefs?
I don't know. I mean, I think it was pretty. If I kind of look, it's probably one of the most successful newsletters in terms of like people who've read it, people who've subscribed as a result, and are probably now shocked that they're receiving a newsletter on the Arctic. Well, it's like, what's that got to do with Creative Briefs? But yeah, I think the point I was making really with it, and with a lot of these newsletters, is really that I think people should read around the subject before drawing their own conclusions. So I don't want to be the one who's like conclusively saying that this is dead or alive or whatever. I think it's a good gesture to share some things that I find particularly interesting, inspiring, worth adding to your thinking toolbox about a creative brief. And I on the other side, I would, with the work you guys do, client side, I do think there's immense value in the clients really understanding, what, if they're going to put the brief together or a brief together, making sure there's a discipline and a craft to how they do that. Because I think that's probably really sort of where we're headed, is that in a project-based world or with more in-house agencies, clients are going to develop more briefs than they ever have. I know when I was head of the strategy committee at the 4As for a number of years, and we'd get calls from the ANA and stuff like, how do we write a creative brief? We got, members of the ANA who want to know, and you'd have a conversation. You'd actually end up on phone calls with like 20 people talking about creative briefs and things.
Interesting you say the ANA, because I've been working for the ANA as a faculty member for their marketing, training, and development center as a creative brief writer, creative brief teacher. And that's where I first heard about this Sistine Chapel analogy. The task force for creative briefs wrote a 17-page white paper, better creative briefs. And it's what triggered Henry and me to start this podcast, because in addition to that great analogy, or how did Pope Julius assign the task to paint the Sistine Chapel to Michelangelo? And there's examples of good and bad versions of what he might have said as a creative brief. In addition to that, which I've used in the training, the recommendation was there should be one creative brief, not a client brief and an agency brief, but one brief. The client and the agency should sit down together and create one brief. And that provoked an argument between Henry and me, because Henry said, no, this is my turf. I write the brief for my agency, for my creatives, and it wouldn't work. And I've since taken Henry's position on that one.
It wasn't exactly my position. My position was that it seems like a lovely idea to collaborate on a creative brief with clients, but that real world practicality problems would stand in the way. Particularly the personality of clients that are very litigious when it comes to briefing documents, and they want to wordsmith every word. They feel uncomfortable about anything that isn't vetted. And so that, to me, really limits what a brief could be, because they kind of are in a box and they want to bring you into that box. And for me, the creative brief is the first step in the creative process, kind of the behind the curtains process, not the last step in the order taking process from the client. So, like I said, it would be great if we could all hold hands and kumbaya, but I just, as a practical matter, I've had too many clients in my near 30-year career to know that I know it's just, with very few exceptions, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, there's my favorite example of that is the Stephen Colbert. It's about a decade ago. The Colbert Show. He goes through the brief for wheat thins. I mean, it's obviously some kind of brief that was given to the show because they were sponsoring a segment, but he decided to use it as a skit. It's one of the best things I've ever seen on client briefs. It's hilarious.
Is it on YouTube?
Yeah.
I gotta find that.
It's absolutely brilliant.
Gonna have to check it out. Maybe we'll insert it into the episode.
It's exactly what you said. It's all about being sued, and it's all about mandatories. No more than 5 wheat thins must be shown in any situation. So they use it as a legal document, not an inspirational document. Yeah. So I get what you're saying, but I'm hoping, given that many clients these days have creatives on site, that is starting to change.
And with the in-house agencies where I've done training, I think the answer to that is yes. It is true.
Mm-hmm.
They buy into the creative briefing process. They buy into
because they're often ex-agency people.
Exactly. Well, I guess one of the things I admire about this post, Ed, is you take an educator's perspective, because it's not all one point of view. You have Ed Sue's position. Well, is the brief dead? And then you have this DA&D perspective from what the creative needs to do to vet a brief. So, I like the way you're thinking on this, which kind of leads to the question: if you were starting over, or even if you weren't starting over, but now with a few years under your belt, how do you see that you've changed your approach to creating a brief?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I do like to have, I'm not gonna put pen to paper unless I've had a conversation with my creative director or the creatives were working on it, mainly the creative director. Yeah, you know, I like to throw around a few thoughts. I do think one of the biggest problem with the brief process has been there's a sort of, because of the way it's structured, it sort of becomes a bit of an like, especially if you're not experienced, it becomes a sort of academic exercise about trying to answer the questions correctly. You know, if you're young, it's, you know, it's what you're going to do. You know, you're straight out of school, you know, oh, this is like a test, better answer it correctly. And you've never worked, you never worked on the resolution of what this thing turns into as in forms of an idea. So you don't know the connection between the two. So you end up with a document that is really, it may be incredibly smart, it may be incredibly, but it's just not inspiring and it's not going to lead to any great work. So I think that's a lot of times the problem with creative people have with briefs is that they may not actually be wrong. They may almost veer on the sort of academically correct, but there's no way you're going to use it to make really good work. So I do feel like often I do tend to work, or if the work agencies I do work with have been more creative in their nature, there is the first going in point as like, okay, we look at the space, we look at the category, we look at the brand, and we think, and you know, we think about the world outside and what people are doing, and we think about opportunities. You know, what could be an interesting way of doing this. And you know, in the past, I would have, done all the bad things. You know, develop my own. I mean, I've been guilty as anyone else of like totally championing my own idea, believing this is the right thing that everyone needs to do. And I do feel that it's sort of like when you're working on a brief and you've had a bit of time, you've really had a lot. You know, it's what's the word? It's fermented in your brain. So there's all these things have been fermenting in your brain, and you know your output can be this brief, but it's been without the dialogue of anyone else really. It's just your own thoughts putting them down on paper. And I do think a problem often happens is that you're so confident in your own writing, in your perspective, when you come into a briefing session, and I've seen it so many times, where you're almost too confident and too knowledgeable, it's too intimidating to the creative people, because this is the first time they've ever heard of it. They, as a team, haven't really talked about it. They haven't written their first idea. So you're kind of like the cadence is you're in completely different speeds and steps. And you know, that's why I think a lot, like I've been in so many briefings where any questions, blank stares, leave the room. You know,
Precisely because you haven't done that collaborative conversing.
because people, yeah, exactly. I mean, it wasn't a collaborative process. It was a, dictatorial, this is what you're going to do. And, people need time, they need time to think about it. And the time that creatives have to devote to thinking about something, I mean, I think it will be a really good exercise to do, to explain to strategists what creatives have been working on for the past 4 or 5 days and what they have to do today to better understand what you're presenting, what environment you're presenting your brief in. They're not really thinking about what you're doing because they've got to present a whole new TV campaign in 20 minutes to their creative director. So they don't care about what you're saying. They're in the meeting, and it's your meeting, and it's the most important meeting you planner strategists have done in the last week. But to the creative teams in there, they don't give a damn.
Well, that shines a bright light on something that Henry and I have talked about before, and that is maybe you're in the wrong place to do the briefing. Why aren't you in the place where the product lives?
Sure.
Which sort of forces the creatives to, and I get exactly what you're saying. I'm focused on my next meeting. I'm the creative.
I
You're
would
going to brief me. Go
I
ahead,
would
Henry.
say I would say that, certainly there's a danger, right? The danger that the creatives are there just because they have to be and that they're not paying attention. That there's a danger that you mismatch them in terms of the intensity you're bringing to the briefing versus what they have for this thing that they're just hearing about for the first time. And those are all legitimate pitfalls. I think, though, what will separate a better strategist from a more mediocre one is a sensitivity to those things, right? Like understanding your audience, understanding that you got to get in, get out quick. You got to get their attention and keep it. You want to not use the jargon and the bullshit buzzwords from the industry and like explain it to them, not in a patronizing way, but in a way that they actually understand what the hell you're talking about, so that you could get to what the really important part of the assignment is, whatever that is. So yeah, I mean, I think those are all fair pitfalls. As we've been talking, I've been listening to you. One of the things that I keep thanking my lucky stars for was that the first agency I worked at, and I worked there for 7 years, was a small boutique agency, and that I got to wear a lot of hats. So I wasn't slotted directly into a strategy role and then never saw anything else. Like, I mean, I worked in project management and traffic. I worked, when the art director called in sick and an ad needed to be resized, I would do that. And so I got a pretty good grounding in the entire operation of the business, and it gave me that ability to walk in other people's shoes. And as I became a strategist, I really realized that if I had a superpower, it was to empathize with creatives, to understand what their goals and aspirations are, what their pressures and their deadlines are, what they need and what they don't need. Because again, a brief to me, and we talk about it since the first episodes of the podcast, a brief is really an exercise in reductionism, getting rid of all of the extraneous crap that isn't going to help them or one way or another, and more likely is going to hurt them. And getting to it. So I think that's the advice I would give to a young strategist, is really to always be thinking about that audience that you have, which is the creative.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you firsthand from what I'm hearing out there is this is a very tough time to be a young person in advertising right now. You're not going to the office, or you're just recently back in the office. You don't have any political skills. I'm hearing from a lot of people that, if you were a young, reasonably competent strategist, you could probably barge your way into a creative's office and have a conversation. Maybe if you were gutsy enough, let's grab a coffee. I want to talk to you about something. But I'm hearing countless stories of strategists getting tuned out, like Zoom meetings canceled, no informal chats. I think it's very, very hard, a very tough time to be a young strategist in the American agency scene right now.
Well, the good news is that all of those challenges have potential solutions if we were willing to do the hard work, right? Like, put your creative and your strategy, make it so that, you're operating in more of a teams like fashion. Maximize that time together when there is in office time, maximize, and honestly, it also has to be a culture that's fostered from the leadership, right? Like
Absolutely.
if the creative director is telling his people, you guys really should be best friends with the strategists because they're going to help us more than hurt us, that can lead to something. And then the same thing with the strategy leads and the strategy bosses saying, hey, you got to ingratiate yourself with the creatives. And that's part of the role. Every agency, I'm in my 6th agency. So 5 times I've joined a new agency. And the first thing I have to do is win over the trust and the confidence of the creatives. Like walking through the door, if I don't do that, then there's nothing else. So figuring out like the personalities of your creatives, their motivations, not assuming them, getting to know them as people. It, you know, it gets back to this is a people business. Where our I worked for Hill Holiday and Jack Connors. I got to meet the late great Jack Connors, and he said something, it's kind of a cliche, but he said, the thing about our industry is our inventory leaves in those elevators every day,
Right. Yeah. Most
and
important process, yeah.
so it's true. We got to get back to being more in touch with humanity and people.
Yeah, and
So-
I think some people are doing a really good job and have found workarounds. And I mean, the other thing I think I would say is that chief strategy officers and heads of department have a massive responsibility to mentor their young talent, and that is very hard to do if they're getting pulled in a million and one different directions, and they need to be in every client meeting and every pitch, which is increasingly the case. So.
And I wanted to address one thing you said earlier. I totally get and understand that there are agencies in which strategy, maybe because the creative director doesn't, give much credence to strategy or whatever, there might be a culture where strategists are shat upon. But I think if you look at the predominant over the last 20 years, the agencies that have reached the top and the zenith and that have been talked about, they've all been agencies with, pretty good strategy cred. I mean, the Wieden Kennedys of the world, they're no slouches when it comes to strategy. The Shia Days of the world, of course. Even Crispin Porter and Bogusky in its heyday had a very established strategy practice. They were very well known for strategy. So I think, like everything, there's some good and there's some bad. And I think that the really standout agencies that can hold the stage for 5, 10, 15 years have been the ones that have been doing strategically sound work, that it helps them to sell the work and it helps their clients to want to buy the work.
Yeah, agree. Totally agree.
One last thing before we wrap things up, Ed. I mean,
Mhm.
you did, I think, an excellent job. I'm going to reframe your comment here that you said what you've learned really from the whole process over the years of being a strategist is to really keep those creatives, as Henry likes to say, keep a great relationship with the creatives. Is there a second thing that you'd say that you've learned that would also be valuable as advice to a young strategist?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of I guess, I mean, I remember the first thing I worked on. I think the first client I worked on was Black & Decker, and I can't even remember if I actually did this or somebody told me this. It's so long ago, but I remember someone telling me, like, the marketing people don't really know anything about these products. It's the engineers. So you need to go get on a train and go to the office and book yourself a meeting with one of the engineers who made this product, and you'll write a way better brief if you talk to them, because they're so close. It was something akin to that. And I do think that sort of like this interrogation of getting to some kernel of what is the powerful insight idea, and not giving up until you've got something you really feel is strong. Because there's a lot of, and we've all done bad briefs, because you just, it's a brief. We got nothing else. That's it. And it's an average brief at best. It's probably a poor brief because there just isn't any there. So I mean, I guess that's the second thing is, just keep looking under stones relentlessly till you find something that is at least has some power to it. Has a has something that that you think you can use. And sometimes these things are they can be kind of cliches, but they can and they can be truths that have been already done, but you can find better ways of doing them. I mean, we've sort of seen some of these, like FedEx sort of, and other people, IBM, have exploited the sort of intensity of a small business owner. They think nothing about nothing else. They'll even like ignore their children because the most important child is their business. Yeah. And I'm sure you did a bunch of research. You get the same result. It's a sort of like a universal and it's a powerful thing. It may not be as bad as mothers are busy, which is a lot in every brief, which is like no one's going to do anything with that. So interrogate till you find something powerful and emotional. And this Tetley example is a really good example. This campaign that's been running right from Lucky Generals for a few years. It's taken Yorkshire tea from 5th in the market to 2nd, or even maybe number 1. Don't be ashamed of where you got your insight from. So, this campaign that has been massively successful was inspired by a visit to the tea plant, and they saw this little sign that said, "We do things proper." And proper is a sort of a Yorkshire phrase, Yorkshire word that it just means, we go to the ends of the earth to make sure everything we do is fantastic. So they found this was just a sign. It would be in sort of some internal communication. They hadn't really done much with it. And they said, this is who you are. This is exactly who you are. You just haven't done a lot with it. And we could actually take this, because it's true to who you are, and do something really amazing. And what's so great about that is you can say that, our HR people make sure they do HR to the nth degree, and that HR is done proper. They don't even need to talk about the tea, because it's implicit. If you do HR really well, you're going to make great tea. If you're a tea company.
Capodastro bar reference. Story coming soon.
Yeah, I was like, do I want to say it again? I've said it so many times. Have you heard the story about the Capodastro bar?
I'll say it for you. I'll say it for you this time, Howard. Since Howard always is the one that tells the story of the Capodastro bar. It's I think maybe an apocryphal tale of a enterprising young creative or strategist who went to visit the client, which was a piano manufacturer of high-end pianos. And so he went to the factory and is like looking around, everything very impressive. And he runs into like an old timer there at the plant, and he says, "What makes these pianos special?" And the guy opens up the piano and he says, "You see that? That's the Capodastro bar." And he goes, "What is it?" He goes, "Well, what it does is, over time, the piano goes out of tune because the wood begins to warp or whatever. And so in this Capodastro bar, it maintains that the piano stays in tune, but it really only starts to work and do its job in 20 years.
50 years.
Or 50 yees, whatever. So that's why like these opera houses that buy these things and they hold on to them for 50, 75, 100 years. So it was like this little secret about the quality that was built into the pianos, but that we do things proper it felt like kind of like the secret sauce of the Capodastro bar.
Well, it speaks to the intrepidity of a good strategist. I love the verb that you used. Interrogate the brand, the product, until you find something, and don't count. Marketers are smart, of course. Salespeople are smart, but go to the source. Talk to the engineers, or talk to the manufacturer of the piano, and you're going to find something. And
don't discount the humble sources, which is was
Yeah.
like the idea of, oh, it's just a sign in the break room that says we do things proper or whatever, or this old timer who told you, gave you an insight that none of the stack of data, of sales data or whatever we're ever going to tell you about these pianos.
Or the social comments about getting that last potato chip out of a Pringles can. And that causes your hand to get stuck in the can. Now, they took that and blew it up into a crazy idea, but it was laugh out loud funny. And as Charlie Cottrell pointed out in his article that you posted on your Substack piece, the audience related to that. And that's how you build, that's how you build your brand. So, well, listen, Ed Cotton, strategist of insightfulness and decades of experience for some major brands, for some major agencies, and now doing some great thinking on his own and providing all of us with excellent resources through your new Substack blog called Provoke. Thank you so much for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. This has been a delightful
Thank you guys for
conversation.
inviting me. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate you reaching out, and thank you so much.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Ibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.